Hey, SED 4840, it's Karen Granger. I am going to take just a few minutes and check in with you. This begins our third week of class. I have graded all of the personal profiles as well as the responses to your peers. It's really great to meet all of you. Good job on your personal profiles. I'm always amazed at the great things that you all are doing in your classrooms. I'm sometimes sad that we don't meet in a face-to-face setting where we might have a different kind of opportunity to collaborate and share best practices because you all are really doing some great things with your gifted learners. And this class, I think we're fortunate, and it was mentioned in some of the peer responses, we have varying you are working with varying ages of students. We've got some of you in high school and middle school and then in elementary, so that certainly works well. I'm grateful for that. Some of you questioned me on the grading. The actual profile was worth 20 points and the peer responses were 10 points. So I will try to make that a little clearer as we go forward in terms of how the points are distributed. I am going to open Module 2 sometime later on today. And in this module, we're going to look at chapters 4, 5, and 6. There's some great information in these chapters, and one thing that they do really well is they provide, I'm not going to call it a case study, but they provide some clear examples of what it is that they're talking about when they're referencing different perspectives or different ways of thinking. In this module, there are 2 assignments. One of the things I'm going to ask you to do in this module, I'm going to ask you to respond to a peer, but I'm going to ask you to respond in either an audio summary or a video summary, not a written narrative like that we have been doing on the discussion board. There'll be some very clear directions for that. So if you haven't used that way to respond to peers, I just think it's a little bit different, and I often find that students share more in this kind of audio or visual format. So you'll see that in the reflections this week. So real quick, I do want to highlight some of what we find in Chapter 4, 5, and 6. Chapter 4 looks at Operation Houndstooth. Some of you may be familiar with this. The beginning of the chapter, they give the really great example of the child, Auburn, who is concerned that the foster kids have to leave their situation or their living condition, their living placement with clothes and garbage bags. Operation Houndstooth, and in this chapter, really talks about social capital. And the question arises, how do some folks use their intellectual, motivational, and creative assets in ways that manifest outstanding creative production? So how is it that some individuals are really able to tap into I guess they're gifts and talents. And so there's 6 components of Operation Houndstooth: optimism, courage, romance with a topic, sensitive to the human condition or human concern, physical, mental energy, and a sense of destiny. The chapter continues to talk about how to promote these 6 components, and then they do a really good job. There's a great visual, it's figure 4.3, where they talk about 6 approaches of Operation Houndstooth intervention theory, and there's some great comments that are provided in the chapter for you there. Chapter 5 looks at effective curriculum and instruction for gifted learners. We know that many of our gifted learners come with a unique skill set outside of their academic ability. So we certainly want to be sensitive to that. And in an affective curriculum, we know that feelings drive thinking. We know there's a need to focus on the social and emotional side of gifted learners because oftentimes they tend to be vulnerable. And sometimes their uneven development pathway creates a sense of being out of sync. So that is why we really like to talk about and really like to explore an affective curriculum with our learners. So affective components that are present in gifted ed are self-assessment, a philosophy of life, the use of bibliotherapy, a talent development plan, looking at the emotional intelligence. And the book does a really nice job of sharing some situations or some scenarios, and in these scenarios there are goals, outcomes, and activities included. So I encourage you to look at that in the chapter. And yes, I am working from some notes, so that's what you see me fumbling with. There's also some active strategies for working with gifted learners in an affective curriculum. Talks about using sanctions and rewards, using the arts, using PBL, and then the development of counseling skills. And I will say that in chapter 5 and 6, they talk about counseling. And I don't know, or I'd be curious to know how much counseling is provided at your school site for your gifted learners. And then in chapter 6, we look at counseling gifted students from non-white racial groups, conceptual perceptions and perspectives, and practical suggestions. And I think this chapter is really quite interesting in chapter 6, where we look at kind of the struggle between academic achievement and maybe your ethnic or racial group that you might identify with. There were several really good studies that were mentioned that reference peer culture and academic achievement, and we know the power of peer groups. We know that oftentimes when kids are labeled, that sometimes these labels can be teased out and they can be made to feel as though they do not want to be a part of that label. They talk about racial identity development and racial identity conflict. And then they also reference in the chapter, the book, A Hope in the Unseen, and it highlights the pathway of a kid named Cedric. And I have not read the book, but I do think it's a very powerful example of what this chapter is talking about. And lastly, as part of this chapter, they talk about what do we do in terms of developing gifted programming for racially diverse students. One, you got to have faculty, staff, administration who demonstrate cultural competence. You've got to have a counseling piece, and you've also got to have parents involved throughout. You do also have to make sure that folks who are making decisions for these gifted kids who may be from non-white racial groups, what is the immediate impact of a kid being placed into a gifted program? What does that look like? So I encourage you to read chapters 4, 5, and 6 to certainly think about some of the bigger issues that are there. If you have any questions, I don't know if I've already mentioned this, please post and ask the instructor. It provides an opportunity for us to all benefit from the answers. As I said, Module 2 will be up sometime later today, and I will begin grading the last piece of Module 1 sometime a little bit later on this afternoon. I am excited about this semester, and if you have questions, I am always here. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.